So you want to use Wix Automations and you're scrolling through the list of triggers here, but you can't find that specific one that you need in order to set off the chain of actions that will fire the automation. Welcome back to the Wix Wiz. I'm Eitan, and today we're going to be talking about a very special trigger inside of the Wix Automations, which is this Velo code trigger. This is a trigger which is essentially the ace of triggers. It will allow you to create a trigger from pretty much anything you can imagine on your Wix website. We're going to be talking about how to implement the very simple code snippets that you need inside of the backend of your website. And we'll be building a very simple example where you'll have a custom form in your website that will, through automations, submit the data into a Google spreadsheet. If you want to learn how to do all that and more, let's get started. For today's tutorial, we are actually starting off inside of the Wix dashboard, and we're going to be taking a look at automations. To find your automations, you can go over here to the side menu and look for automations, and then go over here to the subsection of automations. What are automations? For those of you who are encountering it for the first time, you can think of it kind of like a mini Zapier, if you're familiar, or Make that's built into your Wix website. And it allows you to execute certain actions using no code at all. And it's based on a trigger and result system. So in order to create an automation, we can go over here to the upper right and just click Create Automation. And we have a few pre-built automations we can choose from. Usually I go over here and just start from scratch. Once we click that, we enter the automation builder. And the first thing that we're asked to do here is to select a trigger. So the trigger is going to be that thing that kicks off our automation. And it could be, as you see here, a bunch of things. I think there are like 30 something triggers that you can choose from. Some task is overdue, a price quote accepted, new contact created, etc., etc., etc. So there are quite a few options here. And once we go ahead and click a trigger, so for example, let's say member approved, then we have the option to go ahead and select an action or some kind of logic that will dictate what happens next inside of our flow. There are also many, many different actions that we can choose from. So this is kind of like a cause and effect scenario. So the trigger is going to be our cause and the action is going to be our effect. Now, what we're talking about today specifically is not the actions actually, but it is the world of the triggers. And specifically, we want to address a scenario where the specific thing that we would like to trigger our automation doesn't actually exist inside of this list of triggers. While it is very long, it doesn't include every single possible thing that you can do on Wix. And so we are going to be discussing this Velo code trigger. And essentially what this is going to allow us to do is to trigger an automation using some code on our website, which essentially allows us to trigger an automation using anything at all. So anything can be our trigger as long as we just call a few lines of code, which I'm going to show you in a moment, that will kick off our automation. Now let's explore how to actually set up this custom trigger using Velo code. And luckily we have some instructions over here from Wix and also a link to some documentation, which we'll take a look at in a moment. But let's go ahead and follow these instructions and I'll show you where to do each and everything. So first of all, you're going to want to have your editor open. I'm currently working in a blank Wix Studio site, but you can also do this completely and totally within classic Wix as well. It'll work exactly the same. So I'm going to go ahead over here and turn on code mode. I'm just going to click start coding. If you're in Wix Classic, you're going to turn on dev mode up here on the upper left. And once we do that, we will have access to our backend code files, which is where we need to install this package that the custom trigger works with. So once you have this open, you're going to go ahead and look for backend and public. And once we're here in the backend, we're going to go ahead and add in a new web module. And let's call this automations. And you can call it whatever you want. The name is not important, as long as you'll be able to find that file later on and know what it does. And once we do that over here, we can go back and continue following the instructions. So the first thing that we have here is that we need to install this at Wix/automations npm package and import the custom trigger object. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to just build out that import. So let's go ahead and get rid of this because we don't really need that. And leave this first import that you see over here. Don't touch that. And right under it, I'm going to go over here and I'm going to say import custom trigger from, and then I'm going to have the name of this package, which I'm going to copy paste just to make sure that I don't make any mistakes. That's Control C. And then right over here, Control V, Wix/automations. And once you do that, you'll probably notice that it's underlined in squiggly red line, and that means that it's not installed yet. So what we need to do is just go and hover over it, and then you'll have this kind of red pop up, and you'll be able to click and install it now. If for some reason you don't see that red pop up, then what you'll need to do is go over to the code panel, go over here to packages and apps, and then go over here and install packages from npm and search for that package over here. And once you find it, you can go ahead and install it. And you can see here that it's marked as installed for me because I already just installed it through the code editor. So we've got that custom trigger from Wix Automations. And the next thing that we're going to need, we see here, is that we're going to use it to run a run trigger method, which we'll learn more about in a moment. And we're going to call it with a unique trigger ID parameter, which is this right over here. So we're going to copy over that trigger ID just so we have it. And I'm going to go back over here to our site, and I'm going to paste that over here as a global variable, const trigger ID. And I'm just going to put that right over here. And if you're setting up multiple custom triggers, so you might have multiple automation flows, and so you might need multiple custom triggers. So obviously these IDs, you're going to need to differentiate between them and use the right ones for the right flows. Since I only have one such flow, then I can just do it like this. But that's an important thing to note as you're developing this for your own site. So now that we have this basic setup in place, I'm going to head over to the custom trigger documentation where we can learn what the next step will be in order to trigger our automation. The next step in the process is going to be to define the payload. This is an optional step, but it's highly recommended if you want Wix to understand what the structure of the data you're going to be passing to the trigger is, and then use that data in the next steps of the automation when you're taking actions. So let's go ahead and define a very basic payload structure, and you can find more details instructions over here about how to set up the payload. But if we go over here to our editor, let me just go ahead and set up an example payload. So we'll do here const, and I'll set up here an example payload. And let's just have a payload with a few fields. So the payload is going to be an object. And for example, what we could do here is say, let's say first name, and we'll have that as, let's say, Bob, and we'll have last name, and we'll have that as Dylan, and we'll have email, and we'll have that as bobdylan@gmail.com. Okay, so this is going to be our example payload structure. And we're going to need to pass that in when we actually run the trigger. We'll talk about that in a moment. But we can also define that within our automation and trigger setup. So if we go ahead and just copy this right over here, and then head back to our automations panel, you'll see here that we can set the payload data structure over here. And you can see here that this is an example of a structure. This is a little more complex than the structure that we set up, but we can go ahead and just replace this with our structure, which is pretty simple, and then just go ahead over here and click Preview Structure on the bottom right. And once we do that, so Wix automatically formats it and now knows what options we have within the data that we're going to get from our trigger. And there's also a note here about using contact ID. We can take a look at that in a moment maybe, but this would be specific for if you need the contact ID for something in one of the later actions, which is not a necessity. So it's possible that you might need it. It's possible you might not need it. It really depends on what your action is going to be after that. So I'm going to go over here and I'm just going to save the structure that we put in. And I want to show you here, before we continue even building out our trigger, I want to show you what the implications are of setting up that payload data structure. So for example, let's go ahead and add in an action here. And let's say here that we want to update a Google Sheet. Okay, so this is what we're going to be doing using our action. So we would need to connect a Google account. So let me go ahead quickly. I'm going to connect a Google account so that we have a Google Sheet. And then we're going to continue with this setup so I can show you what the payload implications are with this specific kind of action. I've completed the setup for this action. It's really, really simple. You just choose a Google account and a spreadsheet from that account, and it's connected. And before we go ahead and do this match data to sheet, what we need to do is just make sure that inside of your sheet, you actually have the column headers that you want to map your data to. So since our custom trigger is a trigger that gets data for first name, last name, email, so that's how I set up my Excel spreadsheet, but it probably, your workflow will probably be the other way around. Like you'll already have a spreadsheet that you know you need some specific data in, and then you set up your trigger based on that. So even though your workflow is different, just make sure that you have these headers, and it's very likely that you'll have them in place already. So once you have those headers in place, now we're ready to match up the data between our automation and the headers that we have inside of the spreadsheet. To match up the data, all we're going to have to do is just click this Match Data to Sheet, and then it's going to open up this pop-up right over here, where we can match between the data that's coming in from our triggers and the different Google Sheet columns. If you don't see it like this, you'll see an option to refresh the data. So just go ahead and refresh, and if you still don't see it, it probably means that you're not connected to the right sheet or you didn't set up your headers correctly. And if I go and select any one of these drop downs over here, then you'll see that I have here the option of first name, last name, and email. And these are actually the data from the payload that I set up. So if I hadn't gone ahead and set up a payload, then I wouldn't be able to go ahead and do this matching here that we're doing. So I'm just going to match these up. So first name, last name, and email. And then you can go ahead and just click Save in order to confirm that configuration. Now that we've done that, we're ready to continue with actually activating our trigger. Back here inside of the trigger menu. So at the very bottom here, after the payload data structure setup, you'll see there's an option here for example method implementation. And if we click that, then it will show us the code essentially that we need in order to actually run and create this custom trigger. So some of the things are stuff that we already did based on the instructions. So you'll notice here that we already have the custom trigger imported, and we already have the permissions web method that came automatically with our web module. But in order to simplify things, and since you're using automations, I'm going to assume that you either have no or low code experience. I'm going to go ahead and copy paste this and show you how to alter it in order to fit your specific automation, because I'm assuming that's what you're going to want to do. So I'm going to go ahead and just copy that right over here. And we're going to head back into the editor. And I'm going to paste that code right over here under what we've already set up. Okay, so we need to do a little bit of fixing up because we have some duplications here. So what we're going to do is we're going to grab all the imports. So everything that starts with import, we're going to cut that out and just put that up here on top instead of what we have. And you'll notice here there's one more package that we need to install, which is the Wix Essentials package. So we're going to install it the same way we did for the other automations package. And you'll notice also that we have now two web methods, which is not a problem, but we don't really need this multiply web method that just came out of the box with our new web method file. So I'm going to go ahead and delete that. And we have just the example here from Wix. And this is a web method called runTrigger that we can then import into our front end and run it in order to trigger our Velo automation. So you'll notice here that it's elevating the custom trigger.runTrigger that has to do with different permissions. I'm not going to dive too deep into it, but I touch upon that topic in various other tutorials that I have on the channel. And then the last thing that we do here is we actually call this trigger method, which is this elevated run trigger essentially. And here we need to pass in our trigger ID. So this is what we're going to replace here with an actual trigger ID. It's not you might want to replace, it's you definitely want to replace. And we're just going to use the trigger ID that we copied over before from our automations set up in the dashboard. So it's essentially this trigger ID up here. And in terms of the payload, so for the first time we're going to run this, I'm going to use the example payload. Obviously, this is not your typical setup because you're actually going to want to pass fresh data in here depending on whatever is triggering your automation. But for this one test, I'm just going to pass in this example payload. Another thing that you can do here is you can wrap this inside of something called a try catch. And this is going to allow you to detect if there are any errors and understand what they are and deal with them. So here inside of, so we just put all the code, the regular code that we copied over into the try. And in the catch, we can do, let's say, for example, console.log error. Okay, just to catch the error that might happen. Another option that we have here is also to return the awaited trigger method. And that should, assuming that this method returns something, which we could confirm here if we check out the run trigger documentation. So we can see here actually that it doesn't return anything, which is probably why they set it up the way that they did without the return. So this is not going to return, but you can just assume that if this works correctly, anything that comes after this trigger method will run. So we could go here and say console.log trigger ran successfully. I hope I spelled that right. I feel like I have an extra letter somewhere, but you get the point. And this is ready for testing now. So before we even try to import this into the front end of our website, what we can do is we can actually run a test here from the back end. And we can do that using this small play arrow here that we have on the side. I'm just going to go ahead and click that. And here it says payload null, which is okay because we're using our example payload for now. And I'm just going to go ahead and click this run button right over here. And let's see what we get here. Okay, so returned with undefined. And we got an error. Let's see what the error is. So description unknown, 404. Okay, so it's actually not a very, okay, here's details, sorry, application error, data. So we don't have a lot of information here about what the error is, but we do have a code 404. And if you're familiar with the different error codes, then 404 usually means not found. You might be familiar with it from different web pages where you try to find a certain page and then 404, that page doesn't exist. So based on that error, and this is not planned, but if you're not new to the channel, then you know that I like to leave in little hiccups like this because if it happened to me, then it's quite likely that it's going to happen to you. So what I'm guessing is based on this 404 error is that I simply forgot to activate or save my automation. So if we go back over here to the automations here in the dashboard, we did everything in terms of setting up our trigger and our action, but I never actually clicked this activate button here on the upper right, which is, I think it could happen to anyone, and it happens to me all the time. So I'm just going to go ahead and click here, activate. Okay, and now our automation is active. So hopefully now if we run the trigger, it should run. So let's go ahead and try that again. So I'm going to go back to our Wix Studio. I'm just going to go ahead and clear the output from our last test, and I'm going to run the test again. Let's see now what happens. There we go. So now we got a message that trigger ran successfully, and we didn't get any error, which leads me to think that the trigger did fire successfully. One thing we could do to check if this actually worked is to go over here to our Google Sheet, and we can see over here that it's been updated with our test data. So Bob Dylan at gmail.com. Okay, so this is essentially the framework now to create any kind of trigger that we want. So now we just need to import that on the front end of our website and trigger it with some data. So let's hop in and see what that might look like and what kind of scenarios we can use in order to trigger our automation. Here we are on the front end of our website, essentially the homepage of our site. And what I've done is I set up a very, very simple custom form. If you're not familiar with the term custom form, I can't even count how many tutorials that touch on that topic. So please, you might want to pause the video and read up on that. But then again, this is really just a very generic example for probably the very specific use case that you have and unique trigger that you want to do. So it's more about how to trigger from the front end than how to use custom forms. And basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to set it up so that if somebody puts in a first name, last name, email, and clicks add to sheet, it will add the names to the Google Sheet using the trigger and the automation. So in order to do this, we're going to go ahead and open up the code panel here for the home page. And we're going to start off by naming our different inputs. So I'm just going to select each one, and I'm going to call this one first name input, and try and spell that correctly. And I'm going to select here last name, and this is going to be the last name input. And I'm going to select the email and make that the email input. And lastly, I'm going to select the button, and I'm going to call this the add to sheet button. Okay, now that we've done all of our naming, we're ready to start setting up our functionality. So first thing, I want to import my run trigger function from the backend to the front end. Before I do that, I just want to make one small alteration, and that is not to use our example payload over here, but rather to use a payload that we're going to pass into the function. So as soon as I get rid of the example payload, so essentially whatever payload we pass in over here, that's the payload that we're going to get and pass to our automation. And I'm going to copy here the run trigger function. I'm going to go back to the home page, and I'm going to import it in our home page code. So I'm going to say import run trigger from backend / and here's whatever you called your file. For me, it's automations.web. And now we can call that here on our front end. So I'm going to get rid of this commented out code over here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to select our button. So add to sheet button dot on click. And here we're going to have a callback function. And what we could do is we could say const sheet info, or essentially what's going to be, to make it more clear to you, this is going to be our payload. And here we're going to have first name, we're going to have last name, and we're going to have email. You could also copy this structure over from your backend if it's more complex. And these are going to be based on whatever the user puts into those inputs. So we're going to select each one of the inputs. So for example, first name input and dot value. And the same thing we're going to do for the other two. Just we need to change the names of the inputs. So here, this is going to be last name input, and this is going to be email input. And now that we have our payload, what we could do is we can call our run trigger function, which we're going to do over here. And this is going to be a promise, so we need to turn this into an asynchronous function. And we're going to say over here, await run trigger, and we're going to pass in our payload right over there. And if we want some kind of indication on the front end that it ran, what we could do, for example, is from our automations.web, we can also choose to return something to the front end. So for example, here we could return, let's say, a message, and we can say here success. Okay. And here, if there's an error, what we could do is we could return also a message, and it will say error. Okay, and that will help us understand in our front end if we actually manage to trigger the trigger or not. This is just one way to do this. It's not the only way. It's just an example. So here on the home page, what we could do is we can say const result equals to await run trigger. And then here I'll just add console.log result so we can see on the front end if it was successful or not. Awesome. So this is the basic setup. It's a really, really simplified version of a form submission. Usually with forms, there are other features that you might want to add in, like certain validations and stuff like that, but I'm really keeping it as simple as possible. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and publish the site, and we can take a look on the live site and see if this is actually working along with our trigger and automation. Here I am on the live site, and let's go ahead and test this out. So for example, here we can put in Tom Smith and email tomsmith@gmail.com, and we can go ahead and click Add to Sheet. Now, I haven't set up any kind of success message here, but if we open up our console, then hopefully we'll be able to see the message that we got back from the backend. And here we got message success, which should indicate that we successfully triggered the automation. And if we go over here to our spreadsheet, you can also see that it says here Tom Smith and tomsmith@gmail.com. Okay, so this is a very basic setup, which from a custom form on your site, you submit data here to a Google Sheet. And again, this is one action that you can connect to that trigger, but you can do a wide variety of actions. You can stack different actions together. It really opens up a lot of cool options here with the custom trigger automation. So we're going to wrap up here. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. If you did, don't forget to give it a thumbs up. And if you don't want to miss out on cool tutorials like this that come out every week, I'd recommend subscribing to the channel, and I will see you next time.